This video was brought to you by NordVPN. A couple of weeks ago, over on the TLDR UK channel, we released a video about the UK's rental crisis. At the time, we kind of assumed that this was a uniquely British phenomenon, but Eurostat data released earlier this month suggests that most of Europe is suffering through a sort of rental crisis, with rents rising fast across the continent. In fact, many European countries have seen rents increase by more than 10% in the last year, and certain European governments, including Scotland and Germany, have started looking at rent controls to contain the crisis. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how much rents are increasing across Europe. Hint, it's a lot. Then we're going to take a look at why they're going up and why we might think that this constitutes a crisis. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start by taking a look at the data. According to Eurostat data released early this month and compiled by the Financial Times, in 2022, rental prices across the entire euro area rose by about 1.7%. And while that might not sound that high, it's about 0.5% above the historic average. And it does mask the fact that in certain countries, especially those considered desirable to live in, rents have been rising remarkably fast. Poland, Hungary, Ireland, Lithuania, and Estonia, for example, all saw rents rise by at least 10% year on year. While the UK, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Denmark, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Montenegro, and Luxembourg have all seen rents rise at their fastest pace since 2017. On top of that, in many European countries, the Eurostat figures actually disguise the extent of the crisis. The Netherlands, for example, has a headline increase in rent of just 1.9%. But that's largely because there are over 2.5 million rent-controlled social homes within the country, which account for about 80% of all rented properties, and which have their rents capped at €800 a month. On the private market, though, rents have skyrocketed there too, especially in cities like Amsterdam, where rents for new tenants rose by an astonishing 11% in 2022. Similarly, while German rents have only increased by 1.7% in the aggregate, that's still the largest annual increase in 5 years, and rents in Germany have been shooting up in the last 9 months. In Munich, for example, rents for new apartments rose by 13% last year, and at the start of last year in Berlin, rents rose by 25% in just a few months. And this problem is particularly acute in Germany, because Germany has one of the lowest home ownership rates in the EU, with over 50% of Germans renting. That's presumably why, on Monday, the SPD announced that they'd be proposing a 3-year rent freeze. For context, Germany currently has a general cap that prohibits landlords from raising rents for existing tenants by more than 20% over 3 years. And the coalition had already agreed to reduce this cap to 11%, but the SPD apparently now even considers this to be insufficient. Something similar has happened in Scotland too, where the SNP have introduced rent controls to try and tamp down prices. But there's reason to be skeptical about the efficacy of these measures, because rent controls can discourage landlords from even entering the market. In Scotland, for example, landlords have responded by selling up, creating a structural shortage of rental properties. Anyway, you get the idea. Rental prices are going up across Europe. So what's actually causing this? Well, we can see 2 major reasons. Firstly, higher interest rates. When interest rates first started rising last year, there was some hope that this could bring housing costs back down to manageable levels. Essentially, some analysts thought that as interest rates rose, mortgages would get more expensive, which would make property a less attractive investment. Instead of investing in property then, people would move their money to stuff like government bonds, which become more attractive as interest rates rise. The hope was that this would bring down property prices across the board, freeing up housing stock and bringing down rental prices as well. Unfortunately for renters though, while house prices have fallen, or at least stagnated in many European countries, rents have gone in the opposite direction. This seems to be because higher interest rates have discouraged would-be first-time buyers who might now choose to rent instead of taking out a high-interest mortgage. But it's not just that though. Increased interest rates also makes life more expensive for landlords with mortgages, who pass on these new mortgage costs to tenants, as well as increasing the cost of construction, which discourages developers from building more much-needed housing stock. This is just one of the ways that interest rate hikes have distributional consequences. In theory, rising interest rates are supposed to take money out of the economy, but in practice, they have a disproportionate impact on poorer and younger people. It's not just interest rates that are affecting things though. The other major thing hitting the rental market is the pandemic. That's because in most European countries, rents actually started rising almost immediately once lockdown restrictions were lifted. Crucially, before interest rates actually started going up. Now, it's hard to pin down quite how the pandemic caused a spike in rental prices, but it seems to be something to do with the fact that many young people stayed at home instead of moving out during the pandemic, which created a demand bubble, as well as the fact that many landlords looked at the slowdown during the pandemic and decided to sell up, which reduced the supply of rental properties. This is exactly what happened in the UK, where temporary tax relief measures introduced by the government to keep the property market afloat encouraged some 140,000 landlords to retire during the pandemic. Now, at this point, you might be asking, why is this actually a crisis? Surely this is just the natural result of the free market. There's lots of demand for rental housing and not much of it. Well, while that is half true, a lot of this is the result of government policies, which has made it harder to build new houses and pushed down interest rates to historic lows, which in turn has inflated house prices. It's also worth saying that whatever the cause, high rental prices are a bad thing because they exacerbate inequality, especially in countries with little social housing, as renting usually involves poorer renters transferring wealth to richer landlords. There's also an intergenerational unfairness here too, because renters tend to be younger. But one of the often overlooked reasons that high rental prices are bad is because they make it harder for young people to have kids. Higher rental and housing prices generally mean that young Europeans can't afford to have children, even if they want to. In fact, there's good evidence that financial pressures are holding back would-be parents. In countries like France and Sweden, for example, wealthier people tend to have slightly more children, presumably because they can afford it. So if European governments want to reverse the accelerating decline in Europe's fertility rate, which most of them say they do, it might be a good idea to start looking at the cost of housing, including renting. Now, following stories and doing independent journalism often requires a fair bit of travel. From attending the NATO summit in Lithuania or Munich Security Conference, to exploring Audis across Germany, or being forced to hang out with fellow Nebula creators. Okay, it's not all that hard. What's consistently annoying though is the technology, because when you need to work from abroad or even just access the services you're used to, it's often way harder than you'd like, requiring endless verifications, validations, and authentications. And as I'm sure you know, that's where NordVPN comes into play, helping you to connect to the internet wherever you want. Whether that's connecting back home so that your work account doesn't freak out, or connecting in another country from the comfort of your living room to get discounts on your next trip. That's right, very often other countries get cheaper prices for things like flights, with research finding that US consumers pay up to 3 times more. Now, NordVPN are actually running a major back-to-school promotion right now, which means that if you sign up for a 2-year plan, you not only get a massive discount, but you also get an extra 4 months. That's a huge discount just for clicking our link. And if you do, then Nord are likely to continue sponsoring a TLDR content. Now, we've been told that sometimes when people hear us talk about NordVPN, they open up a new tab and just start searching, but crucially don't use our link. Now, I'm certainly glad that they get access to the service, but you only get the discount and support the channel through that link. So if you're trying to improve our journalism by signing up to Nord, then make sure you use our link when you do. And that way you'll also get their great service at a discount.